News, science, the unexplained, space and the cosmos, exploring our past, our future, and the mysteries of our universe. Taking a critical look at reality and a journey to the edges of human understanding. The future is now. This is Micah Hanks.
From the high mountains of Appalachia in a bunker below ground. Welcome one and all, it is the Micah Hanks program. I am your host, Micah Hanks, glad to be here. And of course, getting into gear, getting behind the microphone, looking ahead and going in pursuit of the enigmatic as we do every Monday right here on our little corner of the web, kgradio.com, and of course, listen on demand via podcasting apps everywhere, all throughout space and time. So hope you guys are all doing great out there. We've got a lot of news, including some of the ancient variety, some oddities of nature. You're not going to believe this one, but that's right, in recent days, another sighting of a jetpack man. Yeah, they keep happening. Somebody's up to something in the very most literal sense. And while we're talking about looking up, one group of scientists has recently announced their plans to search for signs of extraterrestrial technology. Yeah, we're going to have a few updates on that, both today and in the days ahead. But, of course, with all of the renewed interest in UAP and the government's analysis of that subject, one man has been in pursuit of answers to that, working from within, for probably longer than most. And that is John Alexander, Ph.D. That's right, I have wanted to talk to John in an interview format like this for quite some time. I met John Alexander years ago, along with his wife, Victoria. But we never had an opportunity to talk on the microphone like this, so to speak, and so this has been a long time coming, and we are long overdue. Now, for anyone who may not be familiar with who John B. Alexander, Ph.D. is, going all the way back to the 1980s, John became a leading advocate for non-lethal weapon systems. But this guy has traveled all around the world. He is one of the actual original Men Who Stare at Goats. If you've seen the film, indeed, John actually was intimately involved with some of the activities in government that were the inspiration for that book and, of course, the film of the same name. John also authored a book years ago that to me was one of the most significant books on UFOs that has ever been written. And that book, of course, is UFOs, Myths, Conspiracies, and Realities, because John's whole take was, look, I was working in government, and along with other people who shared similar clearance levels, I formed a group. We went in search of what the government knew about this and started briefing people at different agencies. And what we found, rather than evidence of a long-standing, widespread government cover-up of UFOs, was a lot of people in government who were interested in the subject and willing to help us try and get to the bottom of it, but who didn't seem to know very much themselves. In fact, according to Dr. Alexander, there appeared to be little interest, at least officially, in government regarding UFOs. But of course, in more recent days, especially since 2017 with revelations about the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, and of course the current efforts of the Navy's UAP Task Force, I was all the more interested in getting in touch with John Alexander and talking with him about both the recent updates and all the developments that have been occurring, as well as how that might apply to his existing research regarding government interest in UFOs. Yeah, this is going to be quite a conversation, maybe unlike any that we have ever had together on this program. So, that and much more awaits, my friends. But, of course, as always, as customary, I hope you guys are all doing great out there, that you had a wonderful weekend. I was on the road and very carefully, of course, traversing parts of the Carolinas with guitar in back seat and, of course, mask in front pocket, on my way to weddings, pool parties, and concert venues performing with the band. And as much as I love really great music and performing it, the only drawback to performing outside this time of the year in the southern United States, when it's 90 degrees in the shade and you're standing out there sweating, I normally have a rule about this. I normally never perform wearing shorts. I don't know, it's just a thing. I always like to dress really nice. John Anderson, one of my early mentors in radio, was also a fine musician, and he had a rule. His sage advice was always to dress one cut above how you expect your audience will dress. Now, of course, maybe that kind of changes with the kind of audience you're playing for, or maybe the style of music you're playing. Obviously, the Chili Peppers never took that advice. I think, if anything, bands like them probably dressed one step under. And by that, the Chili Peppers, of course, meant wearing less clothing than their audience did. But anyway, whatever works for you in the style of music you play. I just know this, though. Playing bluegrass, country, and rock and roll on an acoustic Martin guitar over the weekend, I actually broke my code. I had to wear shorts on Saturday. But it was also a backyard outdoor event, and everybody else was wearing, well, shorts or even less. It was a pool party. So hey, everybody was happy. A lot of music fans out there were not happy over the last few days, however, because there was unfortunate news as far as music that comes out of the sweet sunny South, with, of course, the news of the passing of Dusty Hill, the longtime bassist of ZZ Top. That's right, Dusty, Billy Gibbons, guitarist extraordinaire, and, of course, curiously, their drummer, Frank Beard, the one guy in the band without a beard, but of course whose name is actually Beard. Yeah, those three guys have been a long-lasting staple, not only in music coming out of the great Lone Star State of Texas, but really in music and American music in general. And I've often considered the music that ZZ Top performs and produces to be unique in a lot of ways, because one, they are multi-stylistic, and they're one of those few bands that was able to, throughout several decades, starting out in the late 1960s and carrying through to today, they have successfully managed to change with the times and everything that they do while sounding like the era from which it originated still sounds like ZZ Top. Very few bands can do that. And yet ZZ Top has managed to ride the wave of change in the music industry almost flawlessly for years without ever selling out or playing anything but what they do, which is fundamentally American roots music. It's blues. There's a guitar lesson online where Billy Gibbons is breaking down some of the nuances of what he plays, and everything goes back to the great blues guitarists of yesteryear. But Dusty Hill was also so very much a part of all that, with those foundational grooves that he laid down. That whole band, in so many ways, has more groove than most of us have in our little finger. But indeed, Dusty Hill, I believe, age 72, passed away last week. And a lot of people have been asking, this being essentially one of the longest lasting and remaining American rock bands. In fact, I think prior to Dusty's passing, ZZ Top was recognized as being the one American band that has performed together the longest with the original lineup. Never changed since the late 1960s when they first donned hats and cowboy boots and kicked things off. But foreshadowing Dusty's passing from this mortal realm, he had to cancel a show a few weeks back, and they actually had Elwood, Billy's guitar tech, fill in on bass. I think they even had him don a fake beard when he performed. Maybe that was his idea. But in any case, apparently Billy Gibbons has conveyed in the days since Dusty's passing that at the time of that incident, Dusty had grabbed him by the arm and emphatically said, "Put Elwood on the low end and you guys take it to the top." So apparently Gibbons, Beard, and guitar tech Elwood intend to carry on as ZZ Top. Early reports have said that they've already given Elwood the job, just as Dusty would have wanted it, but they don't apparently intend to call it quits yet. And that has to be admired, I think. To have been going as long as they have, as much musicologists as they are performers, and of course, songwriters of some of the most well-known hits in rock music from the last several decades, to display that kind of persistence in the face of adversity, indeed that is to be admired. But Dusty Hill, sir, thank you for all of your contributions to music, roots, and otherwise, and may that mighty stomp groove of yours carry you into the ever after, sir. We appreciate it, and all the hits. One last point about ZZ Top before we get into some news. I remember a number of years ago, and I've told this story before, but Tom Danheiser called me on the telephone at like 10 or 11 o'clock at night. Tom, of course, is a producer of Coast to Coast AM, and he had said, would you come on and wish George Norrie happy anniversary? It was like George's 14th year being in radio. And he said, I'll call you at like 1:15 a.m. And so, naturally, I'm staying up late. Most guitar players are usually up at that hour anyhow, right? But he calls, and I'm on hold, and I hear George start to introduce the next guy who's coming on. He says, there's some really great guitarists out there in the listening audience. And right now, one of them joins us, and I'm thinking, oh, that's really nice. And as I'm sitting there listening, George says, Billy Gibbons of ZZ Top, welcome to the air. Hey, George! And there's that unmistakable Texas drawl, and I'm sitting there on mute, listening on a three-way call with Billy Gibbons and George Norrie, kind of floored, because here's one of my idols, Billy Gibbons, just right there on the telephone, and I'm listening into this conversation. And right after George lets him go, he then introduces me and says another great guitar player who I've actually performed with, Micah Hanks, joins us. How are you, Micah? And I said, well, now, George, I've been in the presence of greatness, having been on a three-way call with you and, of course, Billy Gibbons of ZZ Top. So, yeah, that was pretty cool. And indeed, that was my own connection to that little old band from Texas who hopefully, despite their recent losses, has many more years going out there and making great music. So all the best to you guys. And, of course, to the late, great Dusty Hill. But now, getting to other news, Mark Brady, one of our most trusted newsies out there in the listening audience, sent along this story to me from CNN the other day about a new fossil discovery that suggests that simple animal life might have existed in our oceans as far back as 890 million years ago. According to the article here, recently discovered fossils belonging to ancient sponges might be the earliest known remnants of an animal body, and also predate other sponge fossils by 350 million years. So talking about pushing back the timetables, Elizabeth Turner, a professor of paleontology and sedimentary geology at Laurentian University in Ontario, discovered what she believes are possibly these fossilized structures of sponges that once existed in ancient reefs. She found these in rock samples that were recovered from northwestern Canada. A study on Turner's findings was published recently in the journal Nature, but again, this may represent some of the very oldest actual animal life on planet Earth, apart from that primordial sludge that used to inhabit bodies of water, and of course simple cellular organisms known to have existed around that time. But also in terms of news of the ancient variety, I have to give another hat tip to Mark Brady for this one, because a Stone Age axe, apparently dating back 1.3 million years, was recently unearthed in Morocco. Now look, going that far back and finding unique life forms is one thing, but finding actual tools used by early human ancestors 1.3 million years ago, that's incredible. According to Al Jazeera, who reported on this discovery, they say the find pushes back by hundreds of thousands of years the start date in North Africa of the Acheulean stone tool industry associated with a key human ancestor, that being Homo erectus. This according to the researchers who made the discovery. Apparently it was made during excavations at a quarry on the outskirts of the country's economic capital, Casablanca, and they said this major discovery contributes to enriching the debate on the emergence of the Acheulean in Africa. This according to Aderhaim Mohib, co-director of the Franco-Moroccan Prehistory of Casablanca program. Before this find, the known presence in Morocco of what is known as the Acheulean stone tool industry was thought to only go back 700,000 years, so this adds, yet again, another several 100,000 years to that, pushing those timescales even further back. Or as Graham Hancock often says, things just keep getting older. Well, in truth, we just keep finding older things. They've always been that old, but you don't know until you know, right? You know, the Seven Ages team and I recently caught up with Dr. Martin Sweatman, and he will be featured on a forthcoming episode of the Seven Ages Audio Journal, the archaeology podcast that the guys and I produce. And again, you can find all my podcasts there at micahhanks.com. But we spoke with Dr. Sweatman about what the meaning behind some of the art at the ancient Turkish site of Göbekli Tepe might mean. And that's actually going to be the second part in a two-part series that we've done. The first episode, where we interview archaeologist Sarah Costello, Ph.D., about her work there at the site. That one's actually already available there at sevenages.org and, of course, on your podcast feed if you're already subscribed. But if you enjoy hearing about archaeology from archaeologists, definitely check out the Seven Ages Audio Journal. Göbekli Tepe, so interesting a site, you really can't do it all in one single episode. I mean, you could, but it would be a really long episode. So we've broken this one into two parts with two experts who have gone to great pains to analyze what the meaning of the messages in stone represented at this ancient site may actually be. Also, Edith Wacker sent along this story, and thank you, Edith, an update about the Oregon bootleg fire that is raging out west. In fact, later this year, I had hoped maybe to head to California with my brother Caleb and his girlfriend and a few others, and it's looking less and less likely to occur on account of what's going on out there in states like California and Oregon. But again, disrupting my travel plans is far from being my main concern about all of this, quite obviously. As BBC reports, in the U.S. state of Oregon, the nation's largest active wildfire has burned through more than 364,000 acres, prompting thousands of evacuations. Right now, there are more than 2,000 firefighters tackling this so-called bootleg fire. It's one of the largest blazes in Oregon's history. The fire has been burning since July 6th and has already scorched an area larger than the city of Los Angeles. Just unbelievable. And of course, the widespread damage, people who have been evacuated, people who have lost their homes, the impact this has had on the environment and on wildlife, it's absolutely devastating. It's one of more than 80 major fires right now that are raging across 13 U.S. states, and this spurred by recent heat waves and high winds. Of course, as I've discussed in the past, some of these fires also can be ignited due to problems with electrical infrastructure. In the summer months when it gets this hot and people are naturally baking in their homes and start firing up the air conditioning, this puts a tremendous strain on the electrical grid. And so, of course, in recent days, with the Senate announcing that they are going to probably be moving forward with this bipartisan bill on infrastructure, one of the many things that the current infrastructure plan will be looking at is, of course, improving the electrical grid. My hope would be that this would in some ways also help in terms of preventing fires like these, but almost every summer we see an awful lot of them. The bootleg fire going on out there in Oregon, unfortunately one of the largest in the state's history, and you can imagine the kind of damage that it's been causing. But we also have a number of communities right now, on account of the hot weather out west, losing water. That's right, the Mercury News reporting that in Fort Bragg on the Mendocino coast, city leaders are rushing to install an emergency desalination system. In Healdsburg, lawn watering is banned with fines of up to $1,000 for watering your yard. In Hornbrook, a small town in Siskiyou County, faucets have gone completely dry. And the chairman of the water district is driving 15 miles each way to take showers and wash clothes. I mean, water shortages are something that are very real in some parts of this world, and California is certainly being affected by this, and so they say that the worsening drought that's been occurring out there has been an inconvenience in big cities, but it's already imperiling an alarming number of communities, especially between the Bay Area and the Oregon border where the fire continues to rage on. Severe shortages, according to Mercury News, are not just in small towns and rural hamlets that rely on one or two wells or streams that have run dry. Larger towns with their own reservoirs and water departments are in trouble too. This situation, of course, is getting worse and worse. And of course, this also, much like the record-breaking heat and the ensuing fires, this is the worst drought California has seen since 1977. So indeed, our hearts go out to you guys out there. Please stay safe, stay cool, and if you can, stay hydrated. But in other climate-related news, before we go to the break here, sharks recently have been observed fleeing from toxic red tides and taking refuge in the Florida Canal. The Guardian out of the UK reporting here that residents of Buttonwood Harbor on Longboat Key in Florida have apparently recorded unusual footage of bonnethead blacktip, nurse, and lemon sharks all swimming close to their homes. Florida, they say, has been battling outbreaks of this red tide caused by a variety of algae that blooms in these warmer summer months, and this has been occurring for several years. But this blooms, they say, have been particularly significant. According to marine biologists, Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission reported fish kills over the last week in 9 counties and said that 5 counties generated complaints of respiratory distress in humans. This also connected to the red tide. I gotta tell you, yes, we do live in a changing world. It's awful hard to deny that, isn't it? We should always be aware of the fact that we all play roles as stewards of our environment. And if we want to be able to protect the world that we live in and keep it comfortable, we need to be aware of these kinds of issues. All right, some news about weird things happening in the skies as well when we return right here on the Micah Hanks program. So there's been another jetpack sighting near LAX. That's right, just 4 days ago, a UFO, by definition, showed up in the skies out there near Los Angeles. Federal officials are investigating another reported sighting of a jetpack man flying near the Los Angeles International Airport. According to the Federal Aviation Administration, a Boeing 747 pilot this time spotted a so-called jetpack man at an estimated altitude of 5,000 feet, approximately 15 miles east of LAX on Wednesday around 8 p.m. Obviously not the first time. I think, what is this, number 3? But this was reported, apparently, and Fox 11, a local affiliate, covered the story. The pilot, they said, could be heard alerting air traffic control about the sighting, and I'm going to read now from a portion of the transcript of that dialogue with ATC, where the 747 pilot said, "Possible jetpack man in sight." ATC Tower responds and says, "Was he off your left or right, sir?" And he said, "Right wing." "Do you know what altitude?" "About 5,000. ATC then asked, "SkyWest 3626, did you see the UFO?" And the pilot said, "We were looking but did not see Iron Man." Again, there have been a lot of these sightings going back to early 2020. Investigations by the FAA and the FBI have, to my knowledge, not yet revealed who has been piloting a jetpack around LAX. But again, you got to think that with so many sightings now and investigations by different agencies, it's hard to say that there isn't actually something going on. The question is, what is going on? Is this an actual jetpack pilot? Is it a drone or a UAV that's designed to look like Iron Man? Is it actually somebody in an Iron Man suit? The problem with some of the sightings is that at the altitude that the jetpack operator appears to have been operating, it would have been very difficult to fly a jetpack to that altitude without having to rely on a parachute or something to be able to get back down. And so some have argued that it seems unlikely that this is indeed a conventional jetpack operator. So what's actually going on? Who's been flying around LAX? I'd really like to see where this story goes. And again, thanks to Mark Brady for sending that one along. You know, Jaina the Earth Nerd also wrote to me recently with an update about something unusual seen in the skies, and this actually having to do with the sightings out there in Colorado of mystery drones that occurred last year. And I'll read from the article that Jaina sent along, and thank you for that, Jaina. Apparently, new documents are conveying that there are still questions about these drones that were being seen. KUNC.org reports on this. They said that the report that came out last month on UAP, released by the National Intelligence officials, didn't say anything about the sightings in Colorado. So KUNC asked whether anyone ever solved the mystery about what the objects were, these drones that were being seen over Colorado. If they were drones, who was flying them? And they say the short answer was no. Now, this leaves U.S. Senator Michael Bennet of Colorado greatly concerned, they report. Bennet sits on the Select Committee on Intelligence, which led efforts to get the UAP report released. It describes sightings, mainly by military pilots, that some think might be advanced technology. Though that's different from the descriptions of the drones made by people in Colorado, both mysteries deserve answers, according to Bennet. And they quote him here saying, "Getting to the bottom of these phenomena is a national security imperative." They say for a few weeks around New Year's in 2020, the state was in the national spotlight with these reports describing drones flying in weird grid-like patterns. You guys remember these? We reported on these quite often here on the program. Some journalists, KUNC.org reports, even chronicled their own close encounters. And in fact, we featured audio from that here on the program, and me taking issue with how they were calling them close encounters and acting like these drones that were being filmed, which were obviously drones, were something more extraordinary. But later in the article, they quote Doug Johnson, who is, of course, a volunteer researcher with, you guessed it, the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. I've actually corresponded a good bit with Doug myself, and he's quoted here in the article, noting that one of the things I noticed early on is that some of the activity reported was near Warren Air Force Base. This had piqued his attention. And Doug says that Warren Air Force Base near Cheyenne interested him because it is tasked with securing dozens of active nuclear missile silos on the plains in Wyoming, Nebraska, and Colorado. In fact, he thinks the Colorado sightings could fit a pattern that he's been tracking, something less mystifying than UFOs, but no less perplexing, according to KUNC. and that is government officials taking reports of drones near 24 nuclear power facilities around the country. Johnson said over a 5-year period, 57 incidents occurred, and he believes 5 of them have been solved at the time that he got the list. Of course, the War Zone has covered some of Johnson's research, and he, of course, has worked with them, Brett Tingley and others, covering this ongoing situation. I've heard rumors at times about what the source of these drones might have been, but as far as I'm concerned, with nothing that has been made public yet, they remain very much a mystery, but they also appear to remain drones, not something particularly otherworldly. But even if it's just drones of unknown origins, that, to me, still warrants attention, doesn't it? You know, it was also reported in recent days that slightly more exotic things have been on the mind of Avi Loeb, Harvard astronomer. We've had him on the program in the past and in the days ahead. In fact, next week, I intend to get Dr. Loeb back on the show for a brief update about this, because it was recently announced that Loeb will be heading up what's called the Galileo Project, where he and a group of scientists, including at least one of them from right here in North Carolina, will be looking at the UAP situation. We covered this over at The Debrief. Tim McMillan wrote an article which outlined the entire thing. The Guardian, reporting on this, notes that the Galileo Project, led by Harvard astronomy professor Avi Loeb, was co-founded with Frank Laukian, CEO of Bruker Corporation, a Massachusetts-based manufacturer of scientific equipment. Given the recently discovered abundance of Earth-like systems, the Galileo Project is dedicated to the proposition that humans can no longer ignore the possible existence of extraterrestrial technological civilizations. This according to the team in an announcement made last Monday. The project, The Guardian notes, follows the U.S. government's report from last month on a number of unidentified aerial phenomena that were reported by Navy personnel and Oumuamua, an interstellar pancake-shaped object that entered the solar system in 2017. According to the Galileo Project team, Oumuamua turned out to have highly anomalous properties that defy well-understood natural explanations. We can only speculate by stretching our imagination to Oumuamua, perhaps being an extraterrestrial technological object similar to a very thin light sail or communication dish. Now, of course, depending on who you speak to in astronomy, opinions remain pretty wide and varied about Oumuamua. I would say the majority of astronomers probably think it was just an asteroid. It is evident that the Galileo Project seems to proceed with Dr. Avi Loeb's conviction about it possibly having extraterrestrial origins. But more significantly, as The Guardian notes, the Galileo Project will follow 3 major avenues of research, and these are obtaining high-resolution images of UAP through multi-detector sensors to discover their nature, search and conduct in-depth research on Oumuamua-like interstellar objects, and also search for potential ETC satellites. So this is quite a project, because now we are seeing the explicit mention of study and detection of UAP included in the dialogue. That, I think, is indeed very important. And I'll also mention Dr. Loeb, who is on vacation right now as of this week's broadcast, was kind enough to offer to jump on the call and discuss this from his vacation. I told him, let's wait till you get back. I think the good doctor deserves a little time off, don't you? So with that, we will have Avi Loeb join us for an update next week to tell us all about this. And of course, a lot of you guys out there continue to write in with your thoughts about things, including Michelle, who writes, Dear Micah, hi from St. Petersburg, Russia. Just a quick note, your arguments on the need to include scientists in the study of UAP reminded me of an episode of Radiolab. They covered a story on how the Swedish Navy spent 15 years chasing a sound in the waters just off the coast of Sweden that they thought was coming from Soviet submarine engines. They found out the truth only after finally allowing civilian scientists access to their top-secret information. I think this is a great illustration of what you've been saying. The episode is named Red Herring, if you're interested in listening to it. Keep up the great work, Michelle. Also, Jay writes, Micah, you mentioned something like 45 meteors hit Earth a day. That seems a little low, and he sends along an article from Science Direct, from which we have the following quote, The micrometeorite flux at Dome C, Antarctica, monitoring the accretion of extraterrestrial dust on Earth. Mass distributions were fitted with log normal distributions. Comparison with previous measurements up to higher sizes enabled extrapolation to a global flux covering the 12 to 700 diameter range of Earth's surface. And so apparently they find anywhere from 3,600 plus or minus 1,000 tons per year for unmelted micrometeorites and cosmic spherules, respectively. the mass flux of dust at Earth's surface is 5,200 plus or minus 1,500 tons per year. And so Jay concludes 14 tons a day. That's the estimated amount of space debris that actually collides with Earth. Wow! I guess my estimates were just a little bit off, weren't they? So thank you to both of you guys for writing in with your observations. Anyone else out there who would like to share your thoughts, please write to me, info@micahhanks.com, or you can tweet at me at micahhanks. And of course, you can also find out information about me, where I am on social media, and how to contact me, or find all my podcasts right there at micahhanks.com. Now, when we come back, I felt that with all of this discussion about scientists now getting involved in the search for UAP, and of course the military's renewed interest in this, it was time for us to go to someone with knowledge of how government works, and of course with a long career working in government. And that, of course, is John Alexander, Ph.D., who after serving in the Army became a leading advocate for non-lethal weapons systems. But let me tell you, there's a whole lot more to John's story than just that. In fact, I would say that John has known many of the key players and, of course, has personally pursued answers to the UFO mystery now for decades, and doing so from within government. So we've got a lot to talk with Dr. Alexander about when we return right here on the Micah Hanks program. What do UFOs, remote viewing, and the men who stare at goats all have in common? Well, I have one simple answer for you, and that is one man, and he happens to be my guest this week, John Alexander, Ph.D. I've wanted to talk to this guy for quite some time. We actually met a while back, but having a conversation on the record about all of the various sundry developments in the UFO sphere in recent years is a whole nother matter entirely, and that, of course, is what the focus of the remainder of the program this week will involve. Now, John Alexander, Ph.D., has been a leading advocate for the development of non-lethal weapons since he created renewed interest in the field, and that way back in 1989. He's traveled to all of the continents on Earth, and in his travels has trekked the remote areas of Tibet, including Mount Everest Base Camp, went to Timbuktu in the Sahel in West Africa, met shamans in the Amazon. He visited ancient temples in Burma, Laos, Thailand, and Cambodia. And during his career, John held many positions in special operations, intelligence, and research and development. His last military assignment was as director of the Advanced System Concepts Office at U.S. Army Laboratory Command. And after retiring from the Army, Dr. Alexander joined Los Alamos National Laboratory, where he was instrumental in developing the concept of non-lethal defense. He's briefed the White House staff, National Security Council, members of Congress, former directors of Central Intelligence, and senior defense officials on non-lethal weaponry, but he's also the author of books like UFOs, Myths, Conspiracies, and Realities, arguably one of my favorite books on the UFO topic, and also one of the most compelling, maybe at times controversial too. His newer book is Reality Denied, First-Hand Experiences with Things That Can't Happen But Did. I take it that our guest has had a lot of those kinds of experiences himself, so first and foremost, welcome, John Alexander, Ph.D.
Good to be here. How are we going?
Yes, indeed. It's really good to have you here, John. You know, you and I actually met briefly several years ago. Your wife and you and I all attended an unusual gathering in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. I don't know if you even remember that, but we were all there together that night.
Well, I was actually only there for part of it. That was Larry Priscilla's The Gathering, I take it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting. Victoria was there for the entire thing, but I had a prior commitment in martial arts with my cousin in New Jersey, but I was able to drive down for lunch that day.
Indeed. I hope perhaps we'll have another opportunity to meet sometime and maybe talk a little longer, but of course, we're doing that today. You know, at that time, I hadn't read your book on UFOs, but there's some advice that you give your readers in that book as far as those who want to study the UFO topic. I've kept that with me ever since, and as you put it in the book, have a sense of humor, because sooner or later you're going to be attacked. Understand conspiracy theory, because now you're part of the plot. And have a day job, because nobody's making big money in this topic. Arguably, any success I've had talking about this subject, I probably owe it all to you.
Okay, well, glad you have a day job then.
Yeah, exactly. Let's get into some of what you talk about in UFOs, Myths, Conspiracies, and Realities. Now, this book, of course, came out in 2011. I think in a lot of ways it really foreshadowed a lot of things we have seen in recent years. Let's start with the Advanced Theoretical Physics Project. As you describe in the book, you disclosed the existence of this project, which you were instrumental in helping form. Can you tell those who aren't familiar with it what it was and what it aimed to do?
Yes, let's see, when I started this, I guess I was still a lieutenant colonel, and I was in a position, if you remember, budgets were a little looser in those days. Now, to be sure, I did have a day job myself, meaning I had, regular assignments, but had met with individuals who were interested in the topic, and we all had the not only top secret, but the other special clearances and all that, and said, well, let's put together a group and see where this goes. And we had all of the services represented, the intelligence community, and a number of people from aerospace industry. All of them happened to be male, so I call it the good old boys network, and all were interested in it. And frankly, our premise was that there probably was a deep black program someplace, and one of two things would happen. Either they would beat us severely about the head and shoulders and say, sit down, shut up, get out of the business. Or they might say, and one of the ideas was, well, maybe they want to, let go of the tiger and have help in releasing the data. Neither of which happened, which is kind of interesting. And as you know from the book, I had a series of briefings over years, got to higher and higher levels, including the director or deputy director of all of those agencies you know about or think you do. And it was very interesting. I will draw now the parallel to ATIP, Lou Elizondo's program. And basically our findings were almost identical, only 30 years earlier.
That's really interesting, and I really appreciate that you bring up ATIP so early in the conversation. Naturally, people are eager to hear your thoughts about that, and some already have. I don't want to focus too much on ATIP. I'd rather look at your work, but because of the necessary comparison, I think it is important to kind of get your perspective. You were essentially finding the same sorts of things and looking into many of the same questions decades before the actual Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. Now, at the time that you were looking into this, of course, you were also going to high-level, members of government. Everyone who was actually a member of the Advanced Theoretical Physics Project had top-secret SCI or SITK clearance. This was a requirement, I believe. So what was the feedback you were getting from people at that time about their knowledge? I mean, was there a lot of interest in the topic, or was there very little at all?
Two different major questions there. Internally, what we found out is everybody basically knew what everybody else knew, the common stories. Many of them, the position was, I thought you were doing that. No, aren't you doing it? Who's got responsibility for that? And these include agencies that would have to be involved. I make a huge differential between individual interest and institutional responsibility, meaning many people were personally interested, but that did not translate to, them having an institutional responsibility to study these things or work on it. One of the stories I mentioned is talking to the director of one of those three-letter agencies who said, first of all, we don't do that. There's no, in other words, there's no requirement. Very few people understand how the government works. A major shortfall in many of the UFO quote experts. However, he then went on to say, but let me tell you about the ones I saw. Meaning, here was an individual, head of an agency that would have to have been involved in a collection or have a net out there feeling for any events that might occur, who says, we don't have a requirement to do that or such a network in place, and yet had personal experience of seeing things flying about that he knew were way beyond the technological capability of the government.
Yeah, which, is the weirdest part of all this, because you'd think when members of government themselves have this kind of experience, that would provide a little more incentive for them to want to be involved in the study of it. I tell you, we are just getting this conversation with John B. Alexander, Ph.D., started, and there is a whole lot more to cover about his work in government, looking for answers to the UFO mystery and what the government's actual involvement may have been over the years. That and much more awaits when we return right here on the Micah Hanks program. Welcome back. Continuing our conversation with John Alexander, Ph.D. He's the author of UFOs, Myths, Conspiracies, and Realities, and much more. Of course, we'll have his website linked there in the show notes for all to see and to follow. Definitely keep up with him. It's really going to be great to continue this conversation. I've wanted to catch up with John for quite a while, but of course, for those of you out there who may be trying to catch up with me, if you head over to micahhanks.com, you can do so. And if you aren't already a subscriber to the X podcast, you're only getting part of the conversation. Every week, we continue the dialogue exclusively for subscribers. To sign up, it's easy. Just go to micahhanks.com/podcast, and there in the upper right-hand corner of the page, you'll see X memberships. Just $7 a month to get access to all of the shows. Or, of course, you can become a premium subscriber for just $77 a year, get 1 month free, and of course that gets you access to all of the subscriber content. Sign up for the newsletter while you're there, and be sure to check out, of course, all of the podcasts I produce at micahhanks.com/shows. But as far as this current show goes, getting back into this conversation, John, I think it would be fair to say that working from within government as you did, starting decades ago, John, would it be fair to say that you were effectively, with your colleagues, trying to bring about some form of what we might call disclosure?
Well, that's kind of a sensitive topic.
Sure.
Because one of the things I said is that disclosure has happened and happened and happened, and the UFO community will just not take yes for an answer.
Right.
And I go back to the Twining memo and things that, classified initially, means that for decades they have been saying that UFOs are real. I take great umbrage with all of these things. The government has always denied the existence of UFOs. That's just simply not true. No, they haven't got deeply involved and have been forced into it for a number of reasons. But our initial, thinking was, well, actually, we use what we call the Raiders of the Lost Ark, thinking Roswell was real, that they probably had access to this material, looked at it intensely, could not make head nor tail of it, And if you remember at the last scene of the Raiders of the Lost Ark, there's a huge archive, and you see them wheeling it back in there, and whatever that was the Ark, of course, that they were looking at.
Right.
So we were thinking, well, maybe something like that happened. I came to a very different conclusion sometime later. I do recognize that people, and some that I highly respect, where we come to different conclusions on that and agree to disagree. But the idea was, where do we go forward? Now, after a few years of meetings, I eventually ended up going to SDI Star Wars, meeting with the director of Star Wars, thinking that we would transition this from an ad hoc thing, because we were operating on no funds at all. Now, that's one of the areas where Lou was more successful. He was actually, as you know, able to get some funding on it. We were operating basically on goodwill, and described to General Abramson what we were doing. He was taken aback initially. He had not been informed of what the meeting was about prior. And I had people from various agencies with me who had gone around the room introducing ourselves. And after about 10 minutes, I was doing the initial briefing, and he goes, wait, who are you guys really? So we went back and said, no, this is who we are, who we represent. And we finally got to the thing and said, look, we would like to formalize the program, get it more like ATIP, if you will. And the response was interesting, because he said he was an old fighter pilot. He said, you really got my attention. And while I find that interesting, I can't touch this. And the rationale was that he says, look, and at that time, SDI was, I think, the biggest program in the Defense Department. And we had about a $5 billion budget, which made him a huge target by contemporaries, as well as folks on the Hill who were cutting budgets and wanting to take money away. And he said, look, I'm doing some pretty hairy stuff, but if I get caught, funding something like this, I'll just get crucified. And he did. He didn't give us any money, and he still lost a lot of his budget because people were after it. What he did say is, look, we are going to monitor more of space than has ever been done before. And if you can tell me what to look for, I'll consider putting it in the algorithms. But transitioning and having actual, sponsorship was a bridge too far at that point. And this is where I draw the parallels to ATAP, was that he was able to get it, at least for some period of time, and get it formalized, primarily because he has angels protecting him, namely in the name of Harry Reid, and getting congressional support. And I never had anybody that I had generals that would support me, but and I want to emphasize, whenever I gave the briefing, I would try to get them pregnant, meaning I would ask for something, not something big, but support. And in virtually every case, they were supportive and would pass me on to people to higher and higher levels, which is the antithesis of what you would have found if they were protecting a big black program.
So, John, what it really sounds like is when you were going to these, high-level government officials decades ago and trying to garner support with regard to you and your colleagues' interest in this topic, they not only supported it, but they seemed to want to assist, if they could, in helping you move toward bringing broader awareness, both in the public sphere and also within government, in terms of the study of this phenomena, which fundamentally, as your book outlines, there wasn't a whole lot of study going on in government, contrary to what many conspiracy theorists, and I don't mean that in the pejorative, I mean that in the sense of people who actually conspiracy theorize about what level of involvement government may have had over the decades. You essentially found that they weren't all that interested, but effectively, you really were already seeing decades ago that there would have been support for this, kind of like maybe what we're seeing right now with the efforts of the UAP task force. Am I correct in my understanding?
Well, again, the differential is the difference between personal interest. Yeah, we had quite a bit of that, and a number of people had their own sightings and whatnot. And now I'm going to bring my organization into this and do it formally. And again, we're working on, you see, the budget is a zero-sum game. One of the things that used to, that I would find interesting is going around people in the Pentagon saying, I'm going to go find the money. And meaning that they want to increase the budget for some project. Now, there was no big pot of gold sitting there that you could go and, with your leprechauns and dip the gold out. It meant you were going to take money from somebody else's project. So you got to understand that, internally and including in the black world, there's fierce competition over funding. And I would also mention, it's interesting that ATIP, if was about, they said 22 million. If you look back at the remote viewing program, again, over time, around 20 million. Now, understand that 22 million over, 5 years in Pentagon terms, we're talking, chump change.
Right.
Lunch money. This is not a big deal. It is, I'm sure, from your bank account or mine. But when you're talking in the terms of government dollars, well, I might mention that if I'm digressing too far, let me know, but one of the proposals has been a Manhattan-type project to carry this forward. And I said, okay, Manhattan today would be $22 billion if you amortize what was spent during World War II. $22 billion, all right. Now, what you've got to tell me is what are you not going to do? Because if you're going to spend $22 billion, that means you're not going to spend that $22 billion on something else, and you're going to have to justify it. And that's where the rubber really meets the road in the process. And by the way, it's not understood very well inside the government, and certainly not in the civilian sector.
What specifically, the subject, or with regard to the mechanics of how government works in studying it?
How the budgeting process works. And, mana doesn't not just fall from the skies. And it's a bitter internal fight, both within DOD limits, something called the FIDEP, as well as, when you look at whole of government, the president's budget going forward. And the internal fighting is vicious. There are things called line items, meaning that certain money, we talked about the color of money, meaning certain dollars can be spent on certain projects and not on others, and there are legal ramifications to that. You have reprogramming authority, meaning you can move certain amounts of money, but that depends on the supervisors at various levels, depending on the amount of money, have to approve that. And eventually you have to go back to Congress if you want to move too much money. That's why we know that, 20 million is probably about an upper limit of what you can muck about with without getting severe scrutiny.
Right, yeah, so that number kind of recurs over time. Of course, we are talking with John B. Alexander, Ph.D. He is the author of books like UFOs, Myths, Conspiracies, and Realities, and others. We'll have those linked at the website, and of course have a link to his website where you can learn about a lot of his work, including non-lethal weaponry and also other interesting aspects of government involvement that he has had over the years, many adventures, a lot of different disciplines too. But John, on the subject of the ATIP program, when that initially broke in 2017, when the New York Times article by Ralph Blumenthal and Leslie Kean appeared in print, had you had, if you can speak on this point, had you had any foreknowledge about the existence of ATIP at that time, or was that a surprise to you like it was to many others?
No, actually, it was a surprise. I think I was excluded, although they obviously knew me. That Lou has made that clear. But no, I was not apprised of that previously.
Did the fact that there was an ATIP program in any way contrast with or even conflict with your own previous findings about government involvement, or was it more or less in line with what you had already learned about the government's interest and level of involvement?
No, it's pretty much in line. And as I understand, from what I've learned since then, is that what had happened is the events that had occurred that you now know about off the east and west coast, and somebody, understand it was a rear admiral, finally looked at the videos and all that and said, gee, somebody ought to do something about this. And hence a program was eventually put together. There is still great stigma. One of the things I think that they have done, and one of the minor things that the report that has just been made public does, is to help reduce, not eliminate, the stigma associated with even mentioning UFOs or UAPs. I think over time there has been some more acceptance, but the real question becomes whether or not the government has a role to play in this. And my position there might surprise many people, but again, it's based on complexity. They are part of the defense of the stewards of public funds that are awarded to them from Congress. And, to remain trustworthy, and a lot of people don't. I mean, you hear the horror stories about misappropriation of substantial amounts of money in some cases. And, the $600 wrench and all of those sorts of things. So they are very sensitive to how money gets spent. And if you ask, I can talk about where I think this should go, but it's my bottom line is it is far, far bigger than the U.S. government or any government per se.
Yeah, and I actually would like to get your perspective on where things should go a bit later, but before we do that, when we come back, I want to get your take on a couple of key players in all of this who have really kind of remained at the forefront of the UFO dialogue in recent days. John B. Alexander, Ph.D., is my guest this week. We'll continue this conversation with him when we return right here on the Micah Hanks program. Welcome back. John B. Alexander on the record. This week here on the Micah Hanks program. Truly a pleasure to have him as our guest. Where we left off, of course, I was about to ask him about a couple of individuals who have remained key players in the current UFO dialogue, one of whom actually is a longtime friend of John's. Those two key players, of course, are Robert Bigelow and Lou Elizondo. Now, obviously, you've mentioned Lou a couple of times. Have you been in touch with Lou to any significant extent since he left government and has become fairly visible, maybe one of the most visible players in this arena right now?
Well, he is. We keep in touch periodically, and in fact, in the program Unidentified, I'm in the second season there. Will mention that he was here for 2 days, and we ended up with 2 minutes airtime. But our thinking is, pretty similar. But as I said, where he was successful was transitioning to a formalized program, and I was not able to do that.
Certainly. Now, as far as programs outside of government, though, this brings us back to Bob Bigelow, again, a longtime friend of yours. Back before there was even ATIP, there was, of course, the National Institute for Discovery Science, which you also worked with. And in my opinion, there was some really fascinating research that was being done back in the 90s with that program, especially regarding these great big black triangular-shaped aircraft. Could we talk about your own involvement with the NIDS program?
Well, yeah, I was the first one with NIDS in the infamous ranch. I was with Bob the day that he actually bought what became known as Skinwalker Ranch. It wasn't known as Skinwalker Ranch until much later, and was the first one to actually spend the night there at the ranch.
Oh, wow. Anything interesting happened while you were there?
I got a lot of mosquito bites. No, I mean, that's a very complex story. And over the years, we spent many times there, or many nights there. And there were people who seemed to be more sensitive than others. And a number of very, very strange incidents definitely did occur in physical reality. But as I pointed out, it's not like every night. Jesse Ventura did an interview and asked if he couldn't go up there. And I said, well, A, no, and I can't get you on there, but B, you'd really be bored. Because while all of these events occurred, and it has applicability in the whole UFO world, these major events did occur. But when you amortize them over years, and in the UFO case, over decades and the globe, it's not like things are erupting every night. And with instrumentation, we have been able to capture some of them. And what Brendan Fugel has been doing is increasing the instrumentation that's there and putting considerable amount of effort into capturing some events. But even then, with the cameras there 24/7, it's every once in a while something pops. And again, that's true in all of the UFO field as well. Something periodically happens, and then the attention is attracted to it.
Right. I think it would be fair to say that there's a certain subtlety to the study of UFOs and, of course, their behavior as well. You mentioned Jesse Ventura. I remember that interview where I believe they showed up at your house. Maybe Jesse came there and actually sat down and spoke to you. One of the questions, I believe, had been how Bob Bigelow had managed to get it arranged to have reports of UFOs that normally would be reported to the FAA or even to the U.S. Air Force, how those all got sent back to Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies. And if I remember correctly, your response had been something along the lines of, yeah, I set that up for him. Can we talk about that?
That is correct. It was NIDS, it was long before BASS. This is one of those serendipitous events when I was first assigned to the Pentagon, living in Northern Virginia, and happened to live in a high rise. And it just turned out that one of the guys who they had, Friday night happy hour kinds of things, and one of the other occupants happened to have been the deputy director of security for the FAA. So I knew him personally. He also knew I was interested in weird stuff and thought it was pretty strange. And this was kind of after 9/11, by the way. They became the sacrificial lambs. I might mention the FAA had been screaming about security for years before that. Airlines had been resisting mightily. All they want to do is pat you on the butt and have a happy trip. But anyway, I did know him. So I went to Washington and had an initial conversation and said, look, we're interested in this topic. He was able to set up a secondary meeting where we had Bob Collum was with us, and we came in and met with some senior FAA officials, including guys who had come up through the ranks, meaning as air traffic controllers. Others were just more administrative types. And interestingly, the guys who had experience as air traffic controllers were pretty supportive. I mean, many of them had experiences of reports coming in, while they're on duty, and organizationally, they were just happy to, have an outlet to, make this go away, which, by the way, is the way, that has happened across the board in many governmental agencies. It is, UFOs, UAPs are basically seen as a pain in the ass. And anything that gets it out of my bailiwick is a good plan.
Right. Yeah. Even in recent years, I've reached out to the FAA. I have a pending request with them right now, wanting to know about their level of involvement with the UAP task force, because in the report that we just saw delivered to the ODNI, it actually says that the FAA filters some information back to the UAP task force for analysis. Their official stance over the years, of course, has been that they don't directly collect this kind of stuff. And as we know, thanks to your efforts in the years past, a lot of their information, if they did receive reports, they were, of course, kind of deflected and sent to Bob Bigelow and, of course, the National UFO Reporting Center and other civilian agencies. So it's an interesting aspect of the history of that to hear about your involvement, too. But that brings us to the report that was released, this preliminary analysis that was sent to the ODNI. It does mention the FAA's involvement. It also, of course, really focuses primarily on collection in the last 2 years by the U.S. Navy and the formal institution of a collection system, a mechanism for gathering formal reports from military servicemen and women. I'm sure you've probably read this report as you keep up with this stuff as closely as anyone, probably closer than most. Dr. Alexander, what are your thoughts about this preliminary report and its significance?
Well, I call that a big nothing burger is the kind of the bottom line. But I think people misunderstand. I have talked to those who are integrally involved. What you should know is the report was written by two people, both of whom have daytime jobs that do not include running UFOs. Not sure what you can say, but, across the board, this is much other duties as assigned. Much like Blue Book, by the way. There were only a tiny number of people that were actively assigned to Blue Book, and most of the people in the Air Force there were officers assigned at bases across the world, but they had a real day job. There was not UFOs. And the same is true here with the task force. As far as I know, everybody involved has an assignment not related to UFOs as their primary function, and yet became the stuckies on this. be interesting to see where this goes. Notably, in the report, though, if you'll notice that it wasn't until 2019 that the Navy had formalized a position and how to report these incidents. And finally, the Air Force said they didn't organize until November of 2020. So pretty late to the game. And as from what I understand, that yes, all those agencies listed technically participated, but several were certainly dragging their feet, and this was not voluntary at all. Most of them just don't want anything to do with the topic.
Here again, this reminds me of a couple of aspects that you touch on in the book, the resistance by many agencies to want to have any involvement in UAP studies, and also that important advice that John gave them decades ago, have a day job, it's going to help you. Apparently they do too, huh?
Well, what we've always said internally is that reporting UFOs is not career enhancing. You're not going to see that. You do not want to see that on your report card.
Right. Now, one thing that we have certainly seen in recent days, even if governmental agencies haven't necessarily been thrilled about this, I really strongly suspect that data that has been collected, we know that there must be some data that's been collected that, of course, either has not been supplied to the UAP task force, or at very least has not been described in detail in the preliminary report, maybe even in the report that went to Congress. Again, I can reference former DNI John Ratcliffe going on television and talking about satellite photographs, multi-sensor data. Again, where were there any images in the preliminary report? It very well may be that Congress was briefed on some of these things, but we've already seen some government officials commenting on things that we, in the public sphere at least, haven't heard about. Now, that may be forthcoming, but I would suspect that probably the review process would take longer than the 180-day deadline that was given. I'm not so sure that all the information was even given time to be processed in order for the UAP task force to be able to have access to it to meet that deadline. What are your thoughts?
Well, you're assuming that this UAP task force is a viable organization that's intently investigating these things. Now, I'm sure they have certain deadlines, and that gets their attention more than anything else. But as far as I know, I think all of them are, like I said, have other duties, and other primary duties. The satellite thing is not known or is not unusual. In fact, I think I mentioned in UFOs one that happened many, many years ago, the DSP satellite in geosynchronous orbit, in which it was in the 1960s, but you have an item fly by very close and head towards Earth. What was unique about that is that it's a very cold regime, and this was an IR sensor that picked up something very hot flying within a couple of kilometers of the satellite. So, yeah, that has happened before. It'd be interesting to know what other ones have come in. I would mention my direct supervisor, my last job, the first one was a major general who had come. He was air defense, and his prior position had been at NORAD as a shift officer. And even he was in a brigadier, so pretty high level. But talking to him about what NASA or Northcom, I guess it was under SAC at the time, but they definitely, his position was this aid didn't happen, which was interesting because when you talk to operators on at lower levels who picked up things zipping across the country, they definitely had it. I would mention NORAD was the headquarters. I was thinking of, I was there for a briefing one time, thought I'd be a smart ass and say, okay, do you ever get things that come in and accelerate quickly or make high angle turns and whatnot? And the answer was, you mean UFOs? Yes. It would not carry it further. But it's clear that these were not being, or did not seem to be correlated, and I think the operators learned pretty quickly that it's not a good thing to report. It wasn't going to help you. I might mention, if you go back even to Blue Book and those days, there's an interesting report in the what we call the northern tier sightings. These were the ones that were seen across the northern United States near the missile silos. And there was a report of a UFO being seen by one of the ground observers. And the caveat was, he says, the reason he reported it, he's new. We don't bother with this.
How funny. Gosh. I sent an email to NORAD a while back because being a joint operation between the United States and Canada covering all North America, they are exempt from FOIA. And so I thought, well, I'll try a different approach, and I sent them an email and said, in the spirit of the FOIA, even if you guys aren't necessarily bound to being compliant with Freedom of Information Act requests, would you consider, please, detailing NORAD's current policies and procedures regarding collection of uncorrelated targets, and do you have any of these CIRVIS, CIRVIS reports, or anything along those lines? They didn't get back to me, but I do know that Canadian officials with NORAD got back with John Greenwald a few years ago and actually supplied some of those documents. So, we do know that they're tracking these things.
Yeah, that varies over time, and I do think a lot of it has more to do with individuals, that you do find people. We'll get into various agencies, but we're going back decades. But a number of the highly classified reports, frankly, would have been routinely destroyed, but there were a few key people who got known individually and would get their hands on the reports and keep them. I mentioned in the destruction of classified material, we used to get credit. Annually, there'd be a purge, and you got credit for linear feet of documents destroyed, not what's in the documents. It's just have you burned enough of them. And my point, of course, then, this is before the digital world, but if Washington had kept all of the paper that was incoming in, it would literally sink into the ground. There was so much of it. So most of the stuff, many things were legitimately destroyed. The ones that were saved because of personal interest and somebody pulling it out and just saying, I'm just not going to destroy, keeping in personal files. In fact, when I left military, I had certain files where there was nobody to give them to. So I'm sure that just got chewed up and burned.
Gosh, I almost dread to imagine how much information has been lost over the years, although I don't know if any of it would necessarily tell us anything more about the phenomenon than what we already know. Our guest, of course, is John Alexander, Ph.D. He is the author of books like UFOs, Myths, Conspiracies, and Realities, and we've been having quite a conversation with him. This week, about UFOs, we will continue that conversation right here in a moment when we return on the Micah Hanks program. Who are the men who stare at UFOs? I think we know at least a couple of them based on this conversation. John B. Alexander, Ph.D., is my guest. I really appreciate him being here and having such a wide-ranging discussion about the various aspects of UFOs and government. This week, of course, there will be some additional commentary from our guest for ex-subscribers. And don't forget, of course, he has been a world traveler. John has really been a Renaissance man in terms of all of the areas of government and also private interest that he has maintained over the years, but there's a whole lot more to discuss with him. He has, of course, served our country for many, many years and went looking for answers about the UFO mystery while he was there. And, of course, John, I haven't done it already, but I'd like to take a moment just to thank you for your service to our country. I think it's important to have open-minded and, concerned and aware individuals working in government who do look seriously at these topics like you spent decades doing and, of course, are still doing.
Well, it's, again, personal interest of mine. I mentioned earlier, I think where we need to go is that my approach would be something like, if you're familiar with the Human Genome Project.
Sure.
And terribly, terribly complex. And the approach was that you have multiple countries, the top universities, and most importantly, data sharing. And I think that's the only approach. As you know, I think the complexity is at least as complex as cancer. The effort put into it is minuscule. Interesting that the government has some involvement, but I think this is not a whole of government, but a whole of Earth approach is what is going to be required. And again, with extensive data sharing as opposed to sequestering the information.
Yeah, I certainly agree. Also in your book, I have to touch on this too, because you dedicate chapters to the U.S. government's involvement and also congressional hearings, why congressional hearings didn't occur in the past. In recent days, we have seen some talk about the possibility of there being actual public hearings that are held by Congress regarding this topic. Could you speak to that point briefly about why it didn't happen in the past and whether we may see that in the days ahead?
Well, we came very close to having hearings, and unfortunately, something called the disclosure movement came into town, beating the drums and whatnot, and the people who were supportive at that time ran for the hills and just say, we're not going to have. And in fact, in the book, I actually wrote the initial documents that would have caused it to happen. But that approach of bad government screaming at people and whatnot definitely dissuaded people who were talking about congressional representatives who were supportive. Where did it go? There's also a misunderstanding of, quote, congressional hearings. People think of the Kennedy assassination or 9/11 or something of that nature. I have a report someplace where I forget the exact date and year, but that particular day, something like there were 17 congressional hearings held that day. Most of them last a few hours and have, people come in with prepared responses. But having congressional hearings is, it is not what most people believe them to be. Yes, there are a few and very serious issues, that might run days or whatnot. But again, average hearing is about 4 hours.
Yeah, and it's really debatable, I guess, how much change can actually be affected in a 4-hour window. It may not be that congressional hearings would be the magic bullet many people would be hoping for, although it would be of historical significance. There's been a lot of discussion about back in the 60s when we almost saw that happen, of course, back when then Congressman Gerald Ford was really lobbying for that. Now, again, in your book, you also talk about the Condon Committee, and there's that expression, past is prologue. I've been talking with a lot of scientists in recent days about why we need more scientists looking at UFO data and why the government needs to try and make some available to scientists for independent analysis and review. But in the past, when that happened, i.e. when the U.S. Air Force turned over its information to the University of Colorado UFO Project, the long-term effect wasn't necessarily beneficial to UFOs, although, as you point out in the book, not everything that the Condon Committee determined was necessarily bad or necessarily something that was trying to dissuade the public from thinking that there was anything to UFOs. How should future efforts by scientists in terms of looking at UFO data deal with the phenomenon so that we don't have, as some have referred to it as, Condon 2.0?
Well, my mantra is that trying to help and get the best and brightest involved in this without risking their reputation or livelihood. And therein lies the problem and the stigma. And I think a small step forward is the report of saying, yea, verily, these are real. Somebody needs to look at it. But there's still a huge stigma attached with not only reporting UFOs, but being associated with the field from a reputation standpoint. And particularly if you understand how independent science gets funded and work for grants, when you put in for a grant on whatever the topic is, one of the things that goes along is, who are the people involved and what's their reputation. And in the past, having been associated with any of these fields of phenomena is probably not going to be seen as a good thing if you're, trying to get government money. Hopefully that'll change, but it's absolutely essential. What people don't understand about the Colorado report, which was also known as the Condon report, nobody would take it. The Air Force had tried, several institutions to get them to bid on it, and nobody else wanted it. And Condon picked it up reluctantly, and of course had his own agenda going in to basically put down the field. Now, in reality, is Condon was right in his major finding, because the question was not, are UFOs real? The question was, are UFOs a threat? Haven't been invaded. Now, where I think he was totally wrong was when they said there's nothing to be gained scientifically by studying these reports. I mean, that obviously is just totally false.
Indeed, we could have a whole conversation about all of that, although I know your time is very precious and you've already been so kind with it today. John, let me just ask as we conclude here, what is next for you as far as your pursuits, your interest, and of course, your long-held fascination with the kind of topics that we both, are so fascinated with?
Well, probably won't like it. My recent writings have been highly political. I am quite concerned about where the nation is headed at this time. And, that's been kind of the focus on it. They're doing a number of interviews and, such as this, and some of them on, film and whatnot. We'll see what comes out. I'm always leery until I actually see the program to find out how it's been edited. So, it's just certainly an interesting time, and I think very, very dangerous for democracy.
Right. That, too, a conversation perhaps that you and I should have at some point. For the time being, John, I want to thank you for being my guest here on the Micah Hanks program. Again, this has just been a fascinating interview. I hope we can talk again sometime.
We'll do it.
And again, special thanks to John Alexander for being my guest. As always, there will be some additional commentary from him for ex-subscribers, but that's going to be the final word on this week's edition of the program. Thanks to all you guys out there for supporting what we do. And as always, this show is produced in Asheville, North Carolina. Our executive producers back at Master Control are Race Hobbs and Warren Breger. News tips are provided by Mark Brady, Janet Fitzgerald, and Adam Olson. Music featured on this show is produced by Caleb Hanks, and other show content for this program is produced every week by the wonderful Lauren Ellis. Special thanks goes out to Chris Hayes, Tyler Pittman, Robin Hobbs, Tiffany Mack, Jason Pintrail, James Waldo, and Matthew the Reverend Oakley. And I remain yours truly, Micah Hanks, on behalf of all of us here in the bunker. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay strange out there.